Did you know that firing a tenant is just as important as hiring a tenant? What I mean by that is oftentimes we put a lot of time and energy when we're looking to fill a vacancy in our rental units. We're screening the tenants, we're going through this whole complete process, wanting to make sure that we have the right tenant. But every now and again, we make a bad choice on picking the tenant. You know, on paper, oftentimes a person can look one way, but when they move in, other things can happen. Now, not always is it the tenant's fault intentionally. Sometimes bad things happen to good people. And so we've had tenants that have lost their job or fell on hard times due to uncontrolled circumstances. And so as a human being, we often want to make it right or help out that tenant that's in place and not remembering that this is a business for us. And so you always want to make sure that you keep in mind that running a real estate investment business, owning rental properties, when you are saying yes to that tenant, you are saying no to someone else. If you had a goal in mind as to why you're doing this, you're saving money for your future, you're saving money to put your kids through college, or whatever it is that you are running this business for, we have to keep that first. And so when we see signs or flags that a potential tenant is in distress, we cannot ignore those signs. So let me explain. So we have this property, my husband and I had this property, and we had this property for many years. Now this tenant moved into the property. She had been initially living there with her boyfriend. The boyfriend was living there, no problems. Rent was being paid on time as long as the boyfriend was there. Well, the boyfriend and the girl have now broken up and gone separate ways. Well, the boyfriend moves out, leaving the girlfriend there in the house. Initially, the tenant, she was able to kind of keep up on the rent payments, but we started to see this trend where her payments started to get behind. And she said, well, you know, it's hard times. And in between all of this, she had lost her job, but then she got a job and she was working 2 jobs and she was working to get back on her feet. And so we felt kind of compelled to kind of work with her through this situation and make sure that, you know, she had a roof over her head for her and her children. She was making effort and she was communicating. So we felt okay with kind of working with her and working through this situation. But the minute that she would catch up on the rent, the next month she would fall behind. And so we let this go on and on. In between that, you know, we would go over to the property to make service calls. What we noticed when we started going over to the property, the cleanliness of the property started to go downhill. And then, you know, from going over there a little bit more, we noticed that a friend who's not living there started to be there when we would show up more and more frequently, which started to tell us that she had a new roommate, so to speak, living in the property, but the cleanliness of the home we started to see started to deteriorate. Now, we noticed these items and we noticed what was going on with it, but instead of addressing the situation and asking questions or maybe not renewing the lease at times, we decided to continue to work with her and it bit us in the butt. So you want to remember that sometimes when you let things drag on for too long, it can come back to bite you. And that's exactly what happened. So this same young lady who at once upon a time was keeping up on her rent, who cleaned the home, we started to realize that it was actually the boyfriend that helped keep the place clean and was paying the rent. And the minute that she got out on her own, we started seeing problems within the household. We started seeing crayon markings on the wall. So I want to share this with you guys. If you are a real estate investor and you have rental properties or signs to tell your property managers to look for. The first thing that I would want to say is if you are out of town and you're not local to where your properties are, or if you are local, you have a property manager, it may cost you a few extra bucks, but one of the things you want to ask your property manager to do is to, at minimum, tour the property twice a year. Many managers will only tour like if there's a maintenance issue and they look out for certain things, or they may only go once a year. If you want them to tour your properties additional times per year, they may charge a trip charge for this, but it's well worth it. So make sure in your management contract that you write that in to have them tour the property, I don't know, quarterly. Once a month may be a bit much because once a month comes up very quickly, but at quarterly or at least 2 times a year to have them inspect your property, because that's not written into that management agreement. The second thing you want to do is look for signs or changes in patterns and behaviors of your tenant. When they begin to go through hardships, watch that closely. Do not allow weeks and months to go by without addressing what's going on. Third, when it's time for a lease renewal, don't be afraid to terminate that lease. Now, in most cases, you're going to have to do at least a 30-day termination. You want to follow whatever the lease says. Sometimes it may say 60 days. Whatever your lease agreement says or whatever the requirements are in your state, make sure that you are doing that, and consider giving them that notice and deciding not to renew their lease. The problem that we run into is in most areas, if you are not the one placing the tenant in the property, in our area, we charge 1 month's rent to place a tenant. So that definitely affects your net profit that you will make for your income on your property, but it can save you thousands of dollars in the long run. In our case, we should have sent a 30-day notice the minute that we noticed that the tenant started to fall behind and it got to be too much for her. If we caught that right at the beginning, we could have avoided the costly mistake of the many damages to the property. Now, this tenant didn't put holes in the wall. She just wasn't very clean. So it cost us more money because she wasn't clean. We had to go behind and in many cases replace carpeting, redo flooring, or making sure that we had to pay the entire house after her move out because of the cleanliness. We couldn't just go in and clean the carpet. We actually had to replace the carpet and the padding in the house in many cases. So look for those signs and don't be afraid to cancel the contract or not renew that lease when it comes up for renewal. And then lastly, making sure that you communicate. If the tenant is not communicating with you, they're avoiding you, then that is also a sign that it's time to move on and find a new renter to move into that place. So there you have it. Don't make the costly mistakes that we did of having a tenant in place for way too long. It cost us a few $1,000s to get this property back on track and rent it out. Have a good day, guys.